Hi everybody! This video introduces you to formalism, which is a literary tradition that we're going to be looking at more closely this week. So last week, if you remember, we shifted away from realism to fabulism, which is a literary tradition that deals with events outside of typical human experience. And that includes works like science fiction, fantasy, fairy tales, fables, myths, basically anything that isn't quote-unquote sort of realistic. This week, we're going to focus on another tradition that's sometimes called formalism. And this tradition experiments with the conventions or the rules of fiction in even more radical ways than the works that we looked at last week. So in this slide, I give you a very long quotation from Robin Hemley and Michael Martone that explains this tradition. And in this quotation, they say, "Is there a form called fiction? A formalist might very well answer no. Fiction inhabits, explores, and borrows from other forms. Fictions have long been made to look like collections of letters, diaries, histories, autobiographies, confessions, and scientific reports. Even the realist narrative we call the traditional story can often take the form of a memoir, biography, or history. Each form has a set of conventions, like the Dear Sir and Yours Truly of a letter, that in the formalist tradition becomes the focus of attention. The ability to recognize, manipulate, and recreate these conventions is always present in formalist work. For the formalist writer, convention has the same importance as character for the realist writer." So in other words, instead of focusing on characters, these kinds of works look at the rules or the expectations that we have for fiction. And as I say in this slide, as I just said, this kind of story or these kinds of stories tend to focus on conventions or rules or our expectations around fiction rather than characters. So instead of asking us to consider a character's evolution, they ask us to think about how stories are constructed and evaluate our expectations for fiction. Some of these stories, including the ones assigned for this week, push the boundaries and push the rules of the short story. So, like I said, the three stories assigned for this week fall within this literary tradition. The first that we're reading is called Happy Endings by Margaret Atwood, and it asks readers to essentially choose a plot for two characters. And in the process, it calls attention to the way that writers structure the plots of stories and novels. The second story, which is called How to Become a Writer by Laurie Moore, is a second-person narrator, which means that it uses the personal you and it talks directly to the reader. And it tells a story under the guise, so basically it tells a story while pretending to present instructions for how to become a writer. And then the third story we're reading by Gavin Ford-Covite, which is called When Engaging Targets Remember, is also a second-person narrative. And it's structured as a sort of choose-your-own-adventure story that, similar to Happy Endings, experiments with traditional plot structures. So let me know if you have any questions about these ideas. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing what you guys have to say in your discussions.